Hello and welcome to episode 4 of season 2 of Guido Talks. This is the 18th episode overall. I hope you're enjoying the series, these weekly roundups of all things Guido. Today we're not joined by Paul Staines, the founder and editor of Guido Talks, as he is somewhere over the Irish Sea right now in an aeroplane. Instead, we are just joined by reporter Christian Calgi today, who's going to talk us through some of the top stories this week. So without further ado, shall we dive straight into some of the COVID catastrophes this week? What's been going on?
Exactly. We've had a sort of a triple COVID threat this week, all in the last 2 days of multiple senior breakings of the rules. And, let's start off with the biggest one, the most egregious breaking of the rules I've seen so far, and that is the SNP MP Margaret Ferrier, who got COVID symptoms last Saturday, got a test on the Sunday, came down to Westminster on the Monday, stayed to debate in the chamber, then got a positive test result that Monday, and then got a train back to Scotland. You would have to work hard to have breached as many COVID regulations as she did. She has lost the whip by the SNP. That is essentially as far as they can go in terms of sanctioning her, other than, stripping her of party membership. And now with the ball is in her court, essentially, as to whether she's going to do the honourable thing and actually quit as an MP. But an 80,000 pay packet is difficult to for some people to let go of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Since the story broke, the SNP have been about as on top of it in terms of media management as you could hope that they would be. Nicola Sturgeon has come out herself saying that she should stand down as an MP and all that sort of stuff. But the interesting thing here is the timeline, in my view, because of course she got her COVID test result back on the Monday and travelled back up to Scotland then. But that's her sort of leaving work. Surely she would have informed her whips as to why she was headed back up to Scotland, as to why she needed a proxy vote, as to why she wasn't going to be speaking or voting in person in any of the debates that week. So I think it's entirely possible that the SNP had known about this for 5 days before they acted, and they only acted upon this breaking out into the media. They certainly knew yesterday when the MP herself put out a statement and sort of acknowledged all of this. But I think it's very, very interesting. The SNP have some questions to answer as to when exactly they knew about this and why they only acted once this was out in the public domain.
As per usual with the SNP, there is a sort of thin veneer of competent response, competent comms, but actually you delve a bit deeper and things are not all as they seem. I think we're aware that she informed the party yesterday morning, and Ian Blackford came out with some sort of line about them drafting the statement and informing her of the timeline of when it will be made public, acknowledged that the whip had been withdrawn. But even within that timescale, there seems to have been a lot of keeping things quiet until the comms operation was all in place and they could look as good as possible. And that does seem to have
which
been
is worrying in and
sort.
of itself, because surely you'd want to be able to contact trace people as quickly as possible. I mean, if she was milling around the House of Commons meeting with some potentially quite elderly MPs, it's really important that they get to know they can get their tests, they can start isolating as soon as possible. So all that waiting just for a veneer of PR seems deeply, deeply cynical.
And there are, of course, a lot of old MPs in the Commons. Some are not that bothered about respecting corona guidelines, as we saw this week with Mr. Jeremy Corbyn, who was, the Sun splashed on this earlier in the week, that he was at a dinner party, clearly breaking the rule of 6. It is the latest in a long, long line of corona rule breaking. What else would we expect from a lifetime rebel? It was clearly a breach. He's not going to be fined by the police. I personally appreciated George Eustace's explanation that he proffered. It's very conceivable that, that a socialist of Corbyn's kind can't count that high, and it may have genuinely been a mistake.
I just love his facial expression in that picture. He's sort of turned around from his chair. He sort of knows that he's a bit in the wrong. He looks a bit guilty there, sitting around a table that was laid out for 9 people. Now, he said to The Sun that evening, and it was printed in the story, that eventually there were more people than 6 at the dinner party. What does he mean, as they turned up to sit at the table that was laid out for 9 people? I mean, at what point do you sort of realise, of course you know who you're going to a dinner party with. This is utterly, utterly ridiculous. But it's a shame that he hasn't been fined, because of course the shadow mental health minister, Rosina Allen Khan, said on the Kay Burley show the morning after the story broke in the night, that he should be fined. And of course, his brother was fined for helping organise a COVID protest. So I suppose this sort of stuff just runs in the family.
Yeah, you say his facial expression. It reminded me quite a lot of the infamous I don't think this is a very good idea, Seamus
Yes.
clip from back in the early days of the Corbyn administration. But of course, you know, he's no longer leading the opposition. He can't afford a professional spin doctor, so he didn't have a Seamus to help him out in that situation.
Sorry, are you saying that he had spin doctors helping his image over the last 4 years? My God, what would it have been like without them?
They've been trying their hardest, Tom. And of course, the other person, the third person, was Boris's dad, was Stanley Johnson, who was captured on photograph not wearing a mask. Conversely, the Mirror splashed with that. You had the Sun attacking Corbyn, you had the Mirror attacking the Johnson family. Of course, none of this was party political driven. It was all very conscientious COVID enforcement by the press.
Do you know what? I felt a bit sorry for the political editor of the Mirror, Pippa Crerar, that evening, because clearly everyone in the Mirror's offices were sort of rubbing their hands with glee, thinking, "Brilliant! We've got this awesome scoop. It's going to lead all the pages. The Prime Minister's dad," only to be massively undermined by the much more seismic story of the former leader of the Labour Party, rather than just a relation of the Prime Minister. So you do have to feel a bit sorry for the Mirror team, sort of being undermined there in terms of the scale of the stories.
I perpetually feel sorry for the Mirror editorial team, Tom, and that is not restricted to this week.
Oh, amazing, amazing. Well, we should probably move on from just sort of who broke which coronavirus restriction, because of course there was debate over those restrictions themselves this week in Parliament, as that Brady Amendment that we were talking about last week was eventually not called by the Speaker. Now, this was because, in part, the length of the debate was only 90 minutes, which was a fact that really quite annoyed a lot of Conservative backbenchers. Just 90 minutes to debate the renewing of sweeping powers for the executive with barely any scrutiny whatsoever. Well, actually, no scrutiny whatsoever for another 6 months by the terms of the Coronavirus Act, which is an extraordinary secession of power from the legislature to the executive, entirely unaccountably, without vote, without debate. So it turned out that there was a little concession granted to those backbench rebels like Graham Brady and like Steve Baker, as Matt Hancock took to the dispatch box in the midst of that debate and announced that in future the House would be consulted on measures, and may even, if they're very lucky, if the government decides, they might be given a vote. Now, to me, that didn't seem like an extraordinary amount of concession from the government.
No, it's. I think it was a concession in the sense that a dictatorship has become slightly more benevolent. It seemed to quell a lot of the rebellion, because I think at the end of the day, a lot of those Tory signatories of the amendment were looking for a bit of a symbolic concession anyway. They just wanted to to remind the government that if necessary, there is a lot of tension on the backbenches, and there is the possibility of a government defeat if push came to shove. There was this concession. I think because of the sheer numbers, it's not just a Hancock, where possible in the vague sense. I think we probably will see an increasing consultation of Parliament when these rules are being talked about. But yes, ultimately, sort of both sides won, both sides lost. Politics moves on.
And of course, this just sets it up for an even bigger clash of forces when the government does put forward a new regulation that isn't consulted or voted on by the House. That is going to be an almighty row. So I think purely in media management and party management terms, the government is in a bit of a bind here and will have to really bring this stuff before the House, even though the sort of weasel words of the Health Secretary, oh, we'll do it where possible. I mean, that's not very clearly defined. It's not tight enough in my view, but perhaps the media pressure will hopefully bring that to account.
I'm trying to think of a segue, Tom. Can't think of one. Let's talk about Quangos.
Do you know what? I'll just... You know what? I'm not going to cut any of this out. We're just going to leave this in. Let's talk about Quangos.
Let's talk about Quangos. And of course, last weekend we had the bombshell news. It hacked off all the right people, thanks to the Sunday Times, that Boris is planning on installing Charles Moore and Dacre in the top tier of British broadcasting, Quangos, in the chairman of the BBC and the head of Ofcom. And it ticked all the right boxes. The right were jubilant, the left were commiserating the death of democracy and freedom of the press. And the reality is that Labour have been packing Quangos full of their people for, I think we worked out this year, basically 23 years. People like Adam Bolton were flippantly rejecting the notion that Labour lackeys have been running, so many of the shows behind the scenes. And we went back and we saw that basically the last year of the major government, over half, 57% of political appointees had Tory allegiances versus 32% of Labour. Blair then came to power, and we have had 2 decades of majority Labour appointments. We had over a decade. We had 97 to 2012 of almost consistently over 70% of appointees coming from Labour, affiliated people. We had the chairman of the BBC, I think, gave £50,000 to Labour and was then appointed chairman of the BBC. Can you imagine the outrage if the same had happened with the Tories? And it's just a consistent, hypocrisy. They don't care when the left do it. It's the end of democracy when the right do it.
It's interesting. I think when you look at sort of the senior journalists who are saying this stuff, I mean, obviously you're going to have the partisan people, the sort of the left-wing campaigners on Twitter are always going to oppose pretty much any appointment this government makes. But what I find is interesting is that some of those more senior people in the media who were perhaps quite close to movers and shakers in the Blair world, in the sort of New Labour world, they went to those same dinner parties, they mixed with those same people in Number 10, who now feel a bit ostracised from the new regime, like they're not sort of in there, and so they're much more willing to sort of look over what their pals do and much more keen to scrutinise what this government does, when it's basically exactly the same thing that's been happening, as you say, for decades and decades and decades. And I'm personally think that sort of the Charles Moore stuff specifically has been blown up out of all proportion, because of course this guy is going to be it's suggested that Charles Moore will be the chairman of the board. Now that's not someone who sort of makes the day-to-day running decisions of the BBC. It's the person who holds the BBC accountable, who holds them up to their promise of impartiality and all sorts of other things. So of course you want someone who over the years has been skeptical of the work the BBC has done to be holding them to account. If you had someone who said everything is perfect at the BBC, everything's wonderful, everything's brilliant, they're not going to be able to hold the BBC to account at all. So of course you need someone who's more skeptical at the top there. I mean, this to me makes a great deal of sense, particularly commercially for the organisation, and it's going to need to reform over the next few years, especially leading up to the next charter review.
And especially, of course, because the right now has another option that's about to come into the fore, doesn't it?
Yeah, this is, I assume you're referring to GB News, which is the
Absolutely.
sort of, one of the two major offerings that we might see in the next year or so popping up onto our TV channel lists and screens. GB News is the organisation spearheaded by Robbie Gibb, the former BBC bod who moved into number 10 under Theresa May and is now sort of back in the commercial world, setting up GB News. And this week, or was it at the end of last week, that Andrew Neil was announced would be taking on the chairmanship of it. And of course, that gives it a massive amount of credibility in the broadcasting world, because of course, Andrew Neil is seen across the spectrum to be very fair, very balanced, and basically a titan of broadcasting. And it's interesting how during elections and whatever, people on the left and on the right are just as happy to share his interviews and his forensic analysis, for want of a better word, if forensic isn't a word that has been completely devalued by Keir Starmer in recent months. But no, so Andrew Neil this week appeared on Sky to discuss sort of what he thinks GB News is going to be. And of course, the lazy assumption is, oh, this is just going to be a shock jock Fox News clone. And actually, it seems like it's going to be a lot more nuanced than this. And Andrew Neil was sort of describing how it's going to sit in that space that perhaps exists between the media establishment in the UK as it is currently and Fox News. So not out there, but having sort of personality-led, respected interest journalism that isn't rolling news, but is sort of segment. You sort of go and tune into the presenter that you like the sound of, or that you like the show of, and that sort of segmented way of delivering it seems to work quite well in America, and they're expecting it works quite well over here, and it sounds like they're raising something like £60 million for it, which is not a bad amount of money if you want to kick off a serious new news channel.
No, I'm sure they'll do very well, even against such tough competition from Guido Talks. we might be benevolent enough to let them have a slice of our market pie.
Or indeed our massive budget and our famously sound microphone, technological and broadband prowess.
Just look at the set behind me. Money cannot buy these views.
God, you need to describe this for the people listening on the podcast. This is it's
a
car park you're sitting in.
It's the bleakest view. We have stuck the largest television ever invented in front of it, so we don't have to look at it. But yes, we moved offices this week, and we have a wonderful new office, only blighted by the view of the second floor of a multi-story car park.
Love it. Absolutely wonderful. Shall we get back to politics?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because of course, this week it wasn't only COVID legislation that was controversial in the Commons. It was also that classic, age-old, deeply controversial internal market bill that we've spoken about before on this podcast. Now, someone sort of almost led a charge against it this week. Who was that, Calgi?
My old friend Theresa May is now the rebel. Her and Steve Baker, on different issues, admittedly, but they are the rebel leaders of the Tory backbenches. And she was well, she did in the end rebel in the form of abstaining against a 3-line whip. And this was the third reading of the Internal Market Bill. So it has now cleared all the stages of the Commons. It's going on to the Lords. We'll see how it does there. But it eventually passed with a fairly sizable, I think, an over 80 majority, so larger than the Conservatives' nominal majority. And she was nowhere to be seen, conveniently. And the theatrics faded away. In the end, the rebellion fizzled out.
Yes, it seemed like a decent number of Conservatives abstained, but ultimately the mathematics of the House was such that it passed with an 84 majority, which means that now the Internal Market Bill has cleared all 3 stages of the Commons, and it's on to the Lords. Now, depending on who you talk to in Parliament, some people think that, okay, the Lords will try and amend it, it'll be pinged back, and then the Commons will pass it again with a stonking majority, and that moral force will send it through the upper house. Talking to some people in senior positions in the House of Lords, they don't think it will be that easy, and the government will have to get a bit more creative if it wants to force it through the upper house to become law in time for Brexit, if indeed there is no deal. Because of course the provisions within this bill would only really matter, would only be technically breaking international law potentially, if there was no deal. And the sounds are that a deal is advancing, and that we might well, in a week or two, be nearer that place. So that's something to keep an ear to the ground about. However, all of this didn't stop the EU launching legal action against the UK this week for passing the Internal Market Bill through the Commons. Of course, it's not law yet. It still needs to clear the upper house. But no, the EU Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, launched this sort of, it said that she was sending a letter of formal notice to the United Kingdom about this potential breach in EU law. And this was picked up by loads and loads of news outlets. It was shown into a big thing. It was a big sort of event where Ursula von der Leyen stood in front of a lectern and announced it in a grandiose way. But of course, Ursula von der Leyen didn't announce the 30-odd breaches of EU law that Germany made this year, or the 40-odd that Italy did. Now, it turns out that this is actually a very common process for the Commission to send these legal letters to different countries. We put up a graph on the website this week that shows that actually there are plenty of countries that are ahead of the UK in terms of breaches, and that the UK tends to be actually one of the most law-abiding in the EU. So all of these pieces that were sort of criticising the UK and saying, isn't it extraordinary that the EU has had to send this letter, that's had to think about starting these proceedings? Well, actually, if you look at the ongoing proceedings, there are about 800 in any given year, an average of 30 per member state, and for obvious reasons, this one gets picked up and carried far and wide across the media. But put in context, it doesn't seem that major.
No, I was amazed to see this stat that there are 800 open infringement cases against EU member states, and if anything, it really the amount that this particular one was amped up back home just shows what good participants, how well behaved we have been. And if anything, you look at, I think Germany, according to this graph, has 14 more infringements than the UK does. I wish we'd been a bit more rebellious over the years. If there's all this scope to break these rules and still be a member of the EU, I think we should. Do
you know what? I remember during the referendum, actually quite a lot of Conservative Remainers, and indeed Labour Party Remainers, were saying that, oh no, these rules don't really hamper us. If you look at what Germany does on state aid, for example, oh, they just bend the rules slightly, they more liberally interpret them. Oh, breaking the rules was fine for them when they were arguing to stay in the European Union, but now people are arguing to come out of the European Union. They can't apply the same logic. I mean, come on, we can see the hypocrisy here. It's very, very clear. But I think we should probably leave that sort of Brexit argument there for now. I'm sure it is one that we'll come back to, as we have been since 2015 on Guido Fawkes. But there's been a spat that has been covering the pixels of Guido for the last week and a bit, really, in the trade department, between two of the sassiest members of the cabinet and shadow cabinet, Liz Truss and Emily Thornberry, who've been having a bit of a war of words. And this all started because Liz Truss didn't declare some meetings with the IEA, and then she did declare them, and there was some confusion over whether they were personal or departmental and whether they should have been declared and where. And it was all very sort of process-led. And anyway, they ended up declared, but that didn't stop Emily Thornberry writing a sort of a sassy letter to Liz Truss over that transparency issue, to which Liz Truss replied saying, yes, they had been declared, but why hasn't the Labour Party declared its meetings with the media for the last 4 years, as it promised to do under Ed Miliband as a result of the Leveson inquiry? And now that sassy reply somehow made its way to the pixels of Guido Fawkes, and that set off a chain reaction of Emily Thornberry then complaining that a letter had ended up in the free press. So we ran that as well, and then subsequent letters came out where I think one of the SPADs, one of the special advisors for Liz Truss, has now been called out by Emily Thornberry, saying, "Oh, this special advisor has broken the rules in terms of acting party political." Now, of course, Emily Thornberry's never been in government, so I can understand why she might not know the rules about special advisors, being that she's never been in government, so she's never had one. But the Trade Department are very adamant that no one's broken any rules, so they've been sending incredibly sassy back and forth messages, to the extent that Emily Thornberry, in her most recent reply, just ended up CCing in Guido on the email. Just cut out the middleman.
Exactly.
Guido, as well as the Secretary of State. I wish that far more shadow cabinet and cabinet ministers would do this. It would save us a lot of time.
I mean, to say we were moving offices this week, I was more than happy to just go over and work from Emily Thornberry's office, because it's just been a week of her getting, it's almost like a little sibling who you know exactly how to annoy, and you just keep on doing it, and they keep on getting more annoyed. And every time she sent a letter complaining that it was ending up on Guido Fawkes, we ran it, and then she sent another one, and we ran it again.
Amazing. I just love how she ended up CCing us, because it was the ultimate sort of bitchy move. I've got a deep soft spot for Emily Thornberry. I think she's marvellous. She's a great entertaining presence. And I was worried when she dropped out, or she didn't quite get enough votes in the Labour leadership election to advance to the actual sort of debate campaign stage. And I was deeply disappointed about that, because I think she's one of the best performers at the dispatch box. She's always sort of got this sort of gravitas that I think people like Keir Starmer and certainly Jeremy Corbyn quite lack. I mean, I don't agree with her politics at all, but I think as a sheer force of personality, she's quite a good thing to have in the House of Commons.
She's great. And when COVID's over, by all means, Emily, I will buy you a couple of drinks for the wonderful work you have done for our site this week.
Yes, as long as you CC us in some more departmental emails, that would be great. Well, I think that just about rounds up everything that has been sort of the most exciting things on the site this week, the most read, the most shared, the most interesting. So thank you for sticking with us for this episode of Guido Talks. I hope you'll see us next week. We, of course, won't see you because we're staring into camera lenses. This is how this sort of thing works. It's not two-way. But do write in if you want to. Our email is on the site. And apart from that, tune in next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.